They promoted me. But then, just days later, they slashed my salary by 70%. Imagine the shock. The pride of climbing the ranks crushed by a gut punch so brutal I wasn't sure if I was being punished or played. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and completely blindsided. It wasn't just about the money. It was the principle, the respect I thought I had earned. I tried to understand how this could happen. Why would the person in charge reward me with a fancy new title, only to cut the very pay that made it worth anything? The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just a mistake or bad management. It was personal. What followed was a roller coaster of emotions, confrontation, and a desperate fight for my dignity. But then came a moment, one bold move, one phone call that turned the tables completely. That call didn't just get me justice, it bankrupted my boss and changed my life forever. This is that story. For years, I had poured everything into my job at Crestwood Technologies, a mid-sized software firm nestled in the heart of the city. I was the classic, quiet achiever, never the loudest voice in the room, but always the one getting things done. My team respected me, clients trusted me, and the numbers I brought in spoke for themselves. I'd worked late nights, weekends, and holidays. I missed family dinners and birthdays. All of it felt worth it because I had one clear goal: move up. And when the promotion came, it felt like a dream realized. I was named Senior Account Manager, a role with bigger responsibilities, new challenges, and yes, a raise. At least that's what I thought. Walking into that meeting room where my boss handed me the new contract, I felt pride swelling in my chest. This was it. I was finally recognized. Then everything fell apart. About a week after I started my new position, I received an email from HR with my updated pay stub. My heart sank before I even opened it. The numbers didn't add up. Instead of the raise I expected, my paycheck had been cut drastically, more than 2/3 of what I used to earn. I called HR, hoping this was some clerical error, but their response was cold and dismissive. "Budget constraints," they said. "You should be grateful for the promotion." Grateful? How was I supposed to be grateful for a title that came with a pay cut so severe it jeopardized my ability to pay rent? I felt like I had been trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. When I confronted my boss, Mr. Harris, I thought maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But his tone was curt, almost smug. He told me the company was streamlining costs and that the salary adjustments were necessary sacrifices. He hinted that as senior account manager, I should focus on the prestige, not the paycheck. Every question I asked was met with vague answers or subtle dismissiveness. Worse, I started hearing whispers from colleagues, rumors that Mr. Harris was jealous of my rapid rise, that he felt threatened by my influence with clients. It felt like a cruel game where I was the pawn. I couldn't help but wonder if this was all a setup. After all, why else would he promote me just to undercut my compensation so drastically? As the weeks passed, I noticed changes that confirmed my fears. Projects I'd once led were reassigned to others. Important client meetings were scheduled without me. I realized my boss was actively sidelining me, undermining my work, and slowly eroding my standing within the company. Every success I had built was being quietly dismantled. The emotional toll was heavy. I was angry but also confused and hurt. I started doubting myself. Was I really worth the promotion? Was I imagining this betrayal? I spent nights pacing my apartment, wrestling with frustration and uncertainty. My bank account dwindled, bills piled up, and the stress seeped into my personal life. I was trapped between wanting to fight and fearing I'd lose everything. But then, in the darkest moment, I found a sliver of hope. While reviewing my employment contract one sleepless night, I discovered a clause buried in the fine print, something about salary adjustments requiring written consent and certain protections against arbitrary pay cuts. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't as powerless as I'd felt. I had legal grounds to challenge what was happening. And more than that, I knew there was a way to hit back in a way my boss wouldn't expect. That's when I remembered something else. A former client of ours, someone Mr. Harris had been desperately courting, had a large outstanding invoice with the company. Rumor had it, my boss was hiding it from the finance department to keep cash flow looking better than it was. I had kept the client's direct contact information from previous projects. If I could alert them to what was really going on, the fallout could be massive. I made that one call. What happened after shook me to my core. The client immediately froze payments and pulled their accounts. Other clients followed suit once the news spread. The company's financial stability crumbled. Within months, Mr. Harris's empire was bankrupt, and I walked away with a legal settlement and a reputation stronger than ever. I went on to join a new firm that valued me, not just for my work, but for my worth. This story isn't just about a bad boss or a salary cut. It's about knowing your value and having the courage to stand up when you're being wronged. It's about how one bold action can change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For as long as I can remember, work has been more than just a way to pay the bills. It's been a huge part of who I am. I wasn't the type to clock in and clock out without caring. Instead, I saw my job as something to build upon, a career, a reputation, a future that I could be proud of. I wasn't flashy or loud, and I didn't seek attention. My strength was in consistency, reliability, and delivering results, no matter the obstacles. The satisfaction I felt in knowing I had done my best was what fueled me day after day. I started at Crestwood Technologies almost 7 years ago, fresh out of college with a business administration degree tucked under my arm and a head full of dreams. At first, the tech industry seemed like a whirlwind, fast-paced, sometimes ruthless, and full of jargon I barely understood. But I was eager, and I loved the challenge. I quickly found my niche in account management, where I could combine my knack for organization with the human element of building relationships. Helping clients solve problems became my passion. Every email, every phone call, every presentation was an opportunity to grow and learn. At first, I made plenty of mistakes. I remember staying up late to research clients' industries, triple-checking my reports, and even practicing presentations in front of the mirror. I wasn't just doing a job, I was preparing for a career. Slowly but surely, my efforts paid off. I started landing important clients, building trust, and gaining a reputation as someone who could get things done. My coworkers noticed, too. I became the go-to person when someone needed advice or had a tricky problem to solve. Clients started requesting me by name during meetings, confident that I would deliver clear answers and thoughtful solutions. Those little moments of recognition mattered a lot. They confirmed I was on the right path. In my quieter moments, I allowed myself to dream. I pictured the day when my hard work would be acknowledged not just with a pat on the back, but with a real promotion, more responsibility, better pay, and a stronger voice in the company's future. That vision was a powerful motivator. It kept me pushing through long hours and missed social gatherings. I told myself that the sacrifices were temporary, that they were paving the way for something bigger. The day I got the email inviting me to a meeting with the department head, my heart skipped a beat. Maybe this was the moment I had been waiting for. I prepared carefully, rehearsed what I might say, and imagined the possibilities. Walking into the sleek, glass-walled conference room, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement. The sunlight pouring in seemed to spotlight me, and I wondered if my colleagues sensed the change that was coming. Mr. Harris, my boss, greeted me with a smile that was just a little too sharp. He handed me a folder, and as I flipped through the pages, he said, I'm pleased to inform you that we're promoting you to senior account manager. Your leadership on recent projects has not gone unnoticed. I felt a wave of pride wash over me. After all the hard work, this was validation. This was the moment that made it all worthwhile. I left the meeting with my head held high, clutching the contract that symbolized my achievement. My mind raced with plans, new clients to bring in, bigger deals to close, and the promise of a brighter future. I called my parents, my close friends, anyone who would listen. This promotion wasn't just a step up. It was proof that perseverance pays off. For the first few days, everything felt electric. I was energized, confident, and ready to prove that the company made the right choice. I tackled my new responsibilities with enthusiasm, eager to make an impact. My inbox overflowed with client requests, project updates, and strategy meetings. I stayed late, fueled by coffee and ambition, driven by the idea that this was the start of something great. But then the first warning sign showed up, in the most mundane place, the pay stub. When payday arrived, I eagerly opened the email containing my paycheck details, expecting to see the raise reflected in cold, hard numbers. Instead, I was met with confusion and disbelief. The amount deposited was nowhere near what I had expected. In fact, it was almost 70% less than my previous paycheck. At first, I thought it must be a mistake, an accounting error or a glitch in the payroll system. I reminded myself that companies sometimes take time to process raises, and there might be delays or corrections coming. I decided to wait a few days and then reach out to HR for clarification. But as the days went by, no explanation came, only a growing sense of unease. The sting of betrayal cut deeper than just the missing money. This was a crushing blow to my morale and my faith in the company I had devoted so much time and energy to. How could they reward me with a promotion and then slash my salary like this? It didn't make sense. It felt personal. Worse still, when I finally gathered the courage to speak with Mr. Harris, his response was cold and dismissive. "You need to understand the company is going through a rough patch," he said, avoiding eye contact. "We all have to make sacrifices for the good of the team." I tried to argue, to explain how this was unfair, but he shut me down quickly. It was clear he had no intention of reversing the decision. At that moment, I realized something terrible. I wasn't being supported. I was being undermined. The promotion wasn't a victory at all. It was a trap. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The shock of that paycheck hit me harder than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the money. It was the crushing weight of betrayal and confusion. How could my boss, the very person who had just promoted me, cut my salary by nearly 70%? What kind of promotion was this? I kept asking myself over and over. The feeling was suffocating, like I'd been punched in the gut. I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief and anxiety. I tried to keep up appearances at work, but every task felt heavier, every conversation more strained. The enthusiasm I once had was fading fast. It felt like someone had flipped a switch, and I was left in the dark. I was no longer the rising star I'd envisioned. Instead, I was scrambling just to keep afloat. My dreams were suddenly clouded by a harsh reality that I couldn't escape. Outside of work, the impact was just as severe. My bills hadn't changed, but my income had. Rent, utilities, groceries, everything felt like a mountain I had to climb, with no gear. I tried to cut back wherever I could, skipping dinners out, canceling subscriptions, and delaying purchases. But it wasn't enough. The stress seeped into every corner of my life, making it hard to sleep, eat, or focus. I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. I felt like I was drowning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been played. It was as if my hard work was being used against me. a weapon rather than a reward. The promotion was a cruel joke, a way to mask a devastating pay cut with a fancy title. I thought I had finally made it, but instead, I was trapped in a nightmare with no clear way out. I knew I had to confront this head-on. I scheduled a meeting with the HR department, hoping they could offer some clarity or at least a solution. Sitting across from the HR manager, I laid out everything: the promotion, the salary cut, the promises that had been made and broken. But the response I received was dishearteningly vague. They said the company was restructuring, that salary adjustments were part of a broader cost-cutting effort. It wasn't personal, they insisted, just business. But it felt personal. It felt like my value was being erased, like everything I had worked for was meaningless. I wanted to scream, to demand justice, but instead I found myself nodding along, swallowing my pride. Back at my desk, I began to notice subtle shifts around the office. Conversations became more hushed when I entered the room. Colleagues who once greeted me warmly started to avoid eye contact. Rumors circulated about layoffs and budget cuts, and the atmosphere grew tense. I wasn't just battling my own demons. The entire company was struggling, and I was caught in the middle. Despite everything, I refused to give up. I reminded myself that this was just a chapter in a much longer story. I wasn't going to let this setback define me. Somewhere deep, inside, a spark of determination ignited, a fierce resolve to reclaim my dignity and my future. I began to investigate quietly. I reviewed company financials, talked to industry contacts, and paid closer attention to internal communications. It became clear that the restructuring was more chaotic than anyone admitted. Leadership was scrambling, and decisions were being made without transparency or fairness. It was a toxic environment, and I knew I couldn't survive if I stayed silent. Then one evening, as I was leaving the office late, I overheard a conversation between two senior executives. They were discussing a major client deal that was on the verge of collapse due to mismanagement. The client was considering pulling their contract, which would cost the company millions. My mind raced. This was the opening I needed, a way to strike back, not with anger, but with strategy. The next few days were a whirlwind. I reached out to contacts at the client's company and gathered information on their concerns. I prepared a detailed plan outlining how we could salvage the relationship and even expand it by addressing their pain points directly. It was bold, risky, but I knew it was my chance to prove my worth and expose the company's fragility at the same time. When I presented the plan to Mr. Harris, I expected at least a nod of approval. Instead, I was met with skepticism and resistance. "This isn't your responsibility anymore," he said curtly. "Focus on your new role." His dismissal stung, but it only fueled my determination. If the leadership was going to cut me down, I would rise on my own terms. I decided then that I wouldn't wait for permission. I picked up the phone and called the client directly, bypassing the usual channels. I laid out my strategy clearly and confidently, showing them how we could turn the situation around. The response was surprisingly positive. The client appreciated the personal attention and the fresh ideas. We arranged a meeting to discuss next steps. That call marked a turning point. It was the moment I took control of my own fate. I wasn't just a pawn in a broken system. I was a player with a voice and a plan. The tide was turning, and I was ready to fight for my future. After making that call to the client, everything started to shift. Slowly at first, then with a force I hadn't anticipated. It was like throwing a stone into a still pond. The ripples began small but soon grew until they reached every corner of Crestwood Technologies. The client responded well to my initiative. They appreciated that someone was finally listening to their concerns without the usual corporate red tape. Our meeting went better than I could have hoped. I presented the plan I had prepared, detailing each step we could take to repair the relationship, streamline communication, and improve deliverables. The client was engaged, asking questions, and even suggesting ideas of their own. By the end of the meeting, they were cautiously optimistic. But back at the office, the atmosphere was anything but optimistic. Word got out fast that I had bypassed the chain of command and contacted the client directly. Some colleagues admired the move in whispers, while others kept their distance, wary of the backlash that was sure to come. I was well aware that I was treading on thin ice. Mr. Harris's cold demeanor toward me had only worsened since that call. He called me into his office the very next day, his expression dark and unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, shutting the door behind me. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "I don't appreciate you going around me," he began sharply. "That client is our problem, not yours anymore. You need to stay in your lane." His tone was stern, but there was something else, an undercurrent of fear, maybe even desperation. "You think you can save them? We've got bigger issues." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm only trying to do what's best for the company and for the client. Ignoring their concerns will cost us much more than a little defiance." I was careful not to let anger creep into my voice. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was a business discussion, and I was ready to defend my position. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he shook his head and sighed. "You don't get it. Things are changing here and not in your favor. If you keep pushing, you're going to find yourself on the outside." That warning stung, but it also confirmed what I suspected. Mr. Harris wasn't just angry, he was threatened. My success with the client was exposing cracks in his leadership and the shaky foundation of the company's future. I realized then that this fight was bigger than me. As days passed, the tension in the office grew palpable. Meetings became more curt, emails more clipped. I found myself excluded from some projects I used to lead. It was as if I had become a pariah, someone to be watched, but not trusted. Yet, I wasn't about to back down. I doubled down on my efforts with the client. Every call, every email was meticulous. I made sure our new plan was executed flawlessly, personally checking in on progress and making adjustments. Slowly, the client's confidence in Crestwood began to return. We started signing smaller contracts again, a sign that the tide might be turning. But while I was rebuilding bridges externally, the internal storm was intensifying. One afternoon, I found an email in my inbox that shook me to the core. It was from HR, and the subject line read, "Change in employment terms." Opening it, I discovered that my role was being redefined, again. This time, the promotion was revoked, and I was being demoted back to my previous position. Along with that came a further pay cut. The company was effectively telling me that all my hard work, all the deals I had saved and clients I had brought in meant nothing. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the screen. The injustice was overwhelming. I felt betrayed, powerless, and deeply frustrated. How could they cut me down just when I was proving my value more than ever? It was a blow not just to my career, but to my sense of self-worth. In the days that followed, I tried to maintain professionalism, but it was difficult. The demotion was public knowledge, and whispers followed me like shadows. Some colleagues offered sympathy, others avoided me altogether. The company culture was deteriorating fast, and I was caught in the middle. Despite this, something inside me refused to break. I remembered why I started this journey, the belief that hard work, integrity, and smart decisions could make a difference. I realized that if I wanted to survive and thrive, I needed to find a way out of this toxic cycle. That's when the idea struck me. If I couldn't rely on the company to recognize my worth, I would have to take matters into my own hands. I knew the company's financial health was fragile, their leadership unstable. The botched client deal I had helped salvage was just the tip of the iceberg. I started connecting dots, gathering information, and quietly building a case. I reached out to contacts in the industry and began researching legal and financial options. I was careful to stay under the radar. This wasn't about revenge, but about survival and justice. One name kept coming up during my research: a major investor who had recently pulled out of Crestwood due to concerns about management. If I could reach them with the truth about the company's instability and leadership failures, it could trigger a cascade of consequences. With a new plan forming, I prepared myself for the next move, the call that could change everything. The night before I made that call, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of thoughts, swirling relentlessly like a whirlpool pulling me under. I kept replaying the events that led to this moment: the promotion I never wanted, the sudden pay cut, the betrayal from the very people I trusted, and the fragile state of Crestwood Technologies. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing the truth and protecting everyone else caught in the fallout. I knew the risks of making that call could be enormous. I could lose what little I had left, my reputation, and maybe even my livelihood. But if I stayed silent, I would be complicit in the company's collapse. I spent hours poring over every piece of information I'd managed to gather. Internal emails revealing mismanagement, financial statements showing steady decline, client complaints that had been buried, and the growing list of employees who'd quietly left because they lost faith in the leadership. The most damning evidence came from the recent investor pullout. The major investor had cited concerns about leadership and financial instability as the reason for withdrawing their funding. I had also secured copies of several internal memos from Mr. Harris and his executive team where they discussed cutting corners to stay afloat, ignoring critical problems, and trying to shift blame onto middle managers. I knew Claire, the investor's representative, was my best chance to blow the whistle. We'd met once, briefly during an industry conference. She was sharp, professional, and known for being tough but fair. If anyone could take my information seriously, it would be her. But reaching out to her without company permission was risky. It could easily be used against me as insubordination or breach of confidentiality. Still, I had no choice. The company was heading for disaster, and maybe this call could slow it down, or even save it. I wrote and rewrote my talking points, late into the night, rehearsing what I would say until the words felt natural. I didn't want to come off as angry or desperate. I wanted to be calm, factual, and persuasive. I had to make her see the truth without sounding like a disgruntled employee. I had to remind her that this was about protecting her investment and the people who depended on Crestwood's success. When morning came, I sat at my kitchen table, the phone in my hand trembling slightly. My heart hammered in my chest as I dialed Claire's number. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. Claire here. Hi, Claire. This is Jordan Wells. We met at the Tech Innovators Conference last fall, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm reaching out because I have some urgent information about Crestwood Technologies that you need to hear before it's too late. There was a brief pause, then her voice was alert and attentive. Jordan, I'm listening. I took a deep breath and launched into my prepared speech. I told her everything. The growing dysfunction within Crestwood, the financial mismanagement, the ignored client issues, and the toxic leadership culture that was driving key people away. I shared my personal experience, the sudden demotion, and salary cut despite bringing in millions in revenue, the way my attempts to fix things internally were shut down, and how I had to reach out directly to the client because no one else would act. Most importantly, I emphasized that these problems were systemic, not isolated, and if left unchecked, they would destroy the company's value completely. Claire's questions were direct and probing. She wanted names, dates, documented evidence. I answered honestly and provided her with copies of the emails and reports I had collected. The conversation lasted almost an hour, and by the end I could sense she understood the gravity of the situation. Jordan, thank you for your courage in coming forward. "This is serious, and I will bring this to the board's attention immediately," she said. "Please keep your phone close. We may need to follow up." I hung up feeling a mixture of relief and dread. I had done what I could. Now it was out of my hands. But I also knew this was the beginning of a long, difficult road. Within days, the atmosphere at Crestwood shifted palpably. Rumors flew about an impending audit and investor intervention. Some coworkers approached me with cautious respect. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The tension was suffocating. Mr. Harris's demeanor toward me grew colder and more hostile. It was clear I was now seen as a threat. Then came the call that turned everything upside down. I was summoned to an emergency meeting with HR and Mr. Harris himself. The conference room was colder than usual, the air thick with unspoken accusations. The HR manager slid a formal letter across the table, a notice of suspension, effective immediately, pending an investigation into alleged breaches of company policy, specifically for contacting clients and investors without authorization. I was stunned. The very actions I had taken to save the company were now being twisted into offenses. I tried to explain, to plead my case, but my words seemed to bounce off a brick wall. They painted me as a rogue employee, a liability who needed to be removed. Walking out of that building under suspension was one of the hardest moments I've ever faced. The shame, the uncertainty, it felt like everything I had worked for was crumbling beneath me. But deep down, I knew I had done the right thing. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the truth. Over the following weeks, the situation escalated rapidly. News leaked that the investor was pulling all funding from my Crestwood, citing the concerns I had detailed. The company's stock tumbled, clients grew nervous, and competitors smelled blood in the water. The board demanded Mr. Harris's resignation, and the leadership crisis erupted into a full-blown corporate scandal. All the while, I was preparing my legal defense and compiling my evidence. I knew there would be battles ahead, but the call I made that day had already set off a chain reaction. I had become the spark that ignited a movement to save a company, and in the process, reclaim my own dignity. The days after my suspension felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I was no longer an employee of Crestwood Technologies, at least not officially. But I wasn't going to let them silence me. I spent every waking hour planning my next move. I knew this fight was bigger than a single job or paycheck. It was about justice, about exposing the truth no one wanted to admit. At first, the company tried to isolate me, cutting off access to internal systems, blocking my email and discouraging coworkers from talking to me. But word had already spread about the investors' investigation and the board's growing dissatisfaction with Mr. Harris's leadership. Some of my former colleagues reached out privately, sharing their own frustrations and fears about the company's future. Their voices gave me strength. With legal advice in hand, I began to prepare a detailed report to send to regulatory authorities and industry watchdogs. This wasn't just about internal company drama anymore. Crestwood Technologies was a publicly traded company, and their financial mismanagement could affect thousands of shareholders and employees. I gathered all the evidence I had: emails, contracts, financial reports, and correspondence with clients. I documented every attempt I had made to warn leadership, every blocked effort to fix problems, and every instance of retaliation I had faced. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the unfolding drama. Technology news sites published stories about the investors' withdrawal, Crestwood's plummeting stock, and the board's demand for new leadership. Although my name wasn't mentioned publicly yet, the atmosphere was changing rapidly. Investors were panicking, clients were reconsidering partnerships, and competitors were circling like vultures. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing documents, my phone buzzed with a message from Claire, the investor's representative. It read, "Jordan, we need to talk. Urgent." My heart raced as I called her immediately. "Jordan, Claire's voice was serious but sympathetic. The board has decided to take decisive action. They voted to remove Mr. Harris as CEO and appoint an interim leader to stabilize the company. Your information was pivotal in this decision. We want you to consider joining the transition team as a consultant. I was stunned. Me? After everything they wanted me involved in fixing the company I had just been suspended from? It felt surreal, but I knew this was a chance to make things right. I appreciate the offer, I said cautiously, but I want to be clear. I'm not interested in a quiet advisory role. If I'm going to help, it has to be with full transparency and authority to make changes. Claire agreed, and over the next few weeks, I began working closely with the new leadership team. The transformation was both exhilarating and exhausting. We uncovered even more layers of mismanagement, corruption, and neglect than I had imagined. There were long nights poring over financial records, difficult conversations with disgruntled employees, and tense negotiations with clients who had lost faith. But there was also hope. Slowly, we started rebuilding trust. We reinstated severed client relationships, launched internal audits, and introduced new policies to prevent abuses of power. It wasn't easy. Resistance from loyalists to the former CEO was fierce, but every small victory felt like a step toward redemption. Through it all, my own story became a symbol for change. Colleagues who had once ignored my warnings now came to me for advice. Former allies of Mr. Harris either left the company or were reassigned. The culture of fear and silence began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, Crestwood could be saved. Despite the progress, the personal cost was high. I was still under suspension while serving as a consultant, and my finances were stretched thin. My reputation in the industry was complicated. Some saw me as a whistleblower hero, others as a disruptive troublemaker. I had to rebuild my professional network from scratch and constantly defend my decisions. Yet, through every challenge, I reminded myself why I had taken that first terrifying step to make that call. It wasn't just about fighting back against unfair treatment or reclaiming a lost salary. It was about standing up for integrity, for accountability, and for the countless people who had been hurt by Crestwood's toxic leadership. One day during a tense board meeting, I presented a comprehensive turnaround plan that laid out clear steps for financial recovery, cultural reform, and renewed growth strategies. The board approved the plan unanimously, and the new interim CEO publicly acknowledged the role I had played in bringing about the change. It felt like vindication, but also a reminder that the road ahead was long. I still had to face the fallout from the company's collapse and ensure that justice was served for those who had been wronged. As I left the boardroom that day, I looked back at the building where my nightmare had begun. I wasn't the same person who had walked out under suspension weeks earlier. I was stronger, more determined, and ready to fight, not just for myself, but for the truth, and for anyone else who might find themselves in my shoes. Even though Crestwood Technologies was slowly beginning to stabilize, the personal toll on me was immense and deeply felt. The initial rush of adrenaline from standing up against injustice had given way to the exhausting reality of what it truly meant to fight a broken system and endure the fallout. Every day became a test of my resilience, as the battle stretched on longer than I ever imagined. The stress wasn't just at work, it seeped into every corner of my life. At home, I felt like a ghost drifting through familiar spaces. The long nights filled with worry and the constant pressure had taken a toll on my mental and emotional health. Conversations with friends and family grew strained as I struggled to explain what was unfolding at Crestwood without sounding like I was stuck in a never-ending nightmare. Many of them didn't fully grasp the complexity of corporate politics or the magnitude of the crisis I was facing. Some were supportive but cautious, afraid to get involved. Others distanced themselves, unsure how to help or overwhelmed by the intensity of my situation. I felt profoundly isolated, even though I was surrounded by people who cared. Financial worries compounded the stress. The suspension meant my regular paycheck had stopped, and the consulting role I had been offered was temporary and didn't cover all my expenses. I found myself dipping into my savings and cutting back on almost everything. Simple pleasures became luxuries, and I felt the sting of uncertainty every time I checked my bank account. It was humbling, especially for someone who had worked so hard to build a stable career. There were moments when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, that maybe standing up to the company was costing me more than I could afford. But even in the darkest moments, I held on to the reason why I took that first, terrifying step. This fight was never just about me. It was about fairness, accountability, and standing up for the countless employees, clients, and investors who had been let down by Crestwood's toxic leadership. I thought about the people whose voices were silenced, the ethical boundaries crossed, and the trust that had been broken. If I stayed silent, I would be complicit in allowing that injustice to continue. One of the most difficult parts of this journey was dealing with the media storm that followed. As news of the investors' withdrawal and the CEO's removal became public, reporters sought out every angle of the story. I became known as the whistleblower who exposed Crestwood's internal corruption. Headlines hailed me as a hero in some outlets, but labeled me as a troublemaker or disloyal in others. It was jarring to see my name in print, sometimes without my consent, and to feel my personal story become a public spectacle. I received messages from strangers, some supportive, some hostile. Encouraging words gave me strength on the toughest days, but the criticism could be brutal. Some questioned my motives, suggesting I was seeking revenge or trying to sabotage the company. Others doubted my credibility, painting me as someone who overreacted or misunderstood the situation. It was a strange and painful experience, having my character dissected by people who knew nothing about the long hours, the warnings I gave, or the retaliation I faced. To make matters worse, legal threats began pouring in from Mr. Harris's camp. His lawyers accused me of violating confidentiality agreements and harming the company's reputation. I had to hire my own legal team to defend myself and ensure my rights were protected. Every letter from their attorneys felt like another battle in an already exhausting war. The financial strain grew, and the fear of a prolonged legal fight loomed large. Despite all this, I found unexpected sources of support. A few trusted colleagues reached out in secret, sharing their own frustrations and fears about the company. Their quiet solidarity reminded me that I wasn't alone in this struggle. My family, initially wary and concerned, gradually came to see the importance of my actions and stood by me unwaveringly. Claire, the investor's representative, became more than a professional ally. She became a friend and mentor, helping me navigate the complex and often ruthless world of corporate power struggles. Professionally, I refused to be defined by this crisis. I actively sought out speaking engagements at industry conferences, where I shared insights on corporate ethics, transparency, and leadership accountability. I penned articles and blog posts to raise awareness about the dangers of unchecked executive power. I networked with professionals who valued integrity and long-term vision, determined to rebuild my career on a foundation of honesty and resilience. Watching Crestwood slowly turn the corner was bittersweet. The new leadership team implemented reforms, conducted thorough audits, and worked tirelessly to restore client and investor confidence. The toxic culture of silence and fear began to dissipate, replaced by cautious optimism and a commitment to change. Employees started speaking up without fear of retaliation, and the company's financial health showed signs of recovery. Knowing I had played a role in this transformation was gratifying, but the scars of the ordeal remained. Personally, healing was a slow process. The anxiety and self-doubt that lingered felt like invisible weights. I sought therapy to help me cope with the emotional aftermath and to develop tools for managing stress and rebuilding self-confidence. There were days when the memories of those challenging months felt overwhelming, and I questioned if I would ever fully recover. Yet each step forward, no matter how small, reaffirmed that standing up for what's right, even at great personal cost, was worth it. Looking back, I don't regret that call, the one decision that set everything in motion. It was frightening and uncertain, and it changed my life in ways I never imagined. But it also proved that one person's courage could challenge an entire system and spark real change. After the dust began to settle from the initial storm, I realized the fight was far from over. The consequences of that one phone call rippled through every part of my life, but they also opened doors I never expected. With Mr. Harris gone and Crestwood Technologies under new leadership, the company's focus shifted dramatically toward rebuilding trust and restoring a healthy culture. Yet, for me, it was a time of deep reflection and personal reinvention. The promotion I had received before the salary cut wasn't just a title. It was a symbol of what I had built over the years. I had poured my heart and soul into the company, creating systems and relationships that brought millions in revenue and positioned Crestwood as a rising star in the tech industry. To have that achievement overshadowed by a massive pay cut was humiliating and disheartening. It felt like the very people who benefited from my hard work were now trying to erase my contributions. But the salary cut also forced me to think differently. I had to face the reality that loyalty alone wouldn't protect me from corporate politics or unfair treatment. It became clear I needed to diversify my skills and explore opportunities beyond Crestwood. I began taking online courses to sharpen my expertise in data analytics and project management, areas I knew would be valuable regardless of where my career took me. I also started building my personal brand online, sharing insights about leadership, resilience, and standing up to unfair treatment. Writing became a form of therapy and empowerment. I connected with others who had faced similar struggles and realized I was not alone. Social media groups and professional forums became my new support network, filled with stories of people who had turned setbacks into comebacks. Meanwhile, Crestwood's new leadership reached out to me. They recognized the mistakes made during the transition and wanted to involve me in the company's turnaround. They offered me a consultant role, advising on ethical business practices and helping to rebuild client relationships. Although the role was temporary and came with a modest pay, it was an opportunity to help steer Crestwood back on track and to reclaim some of the respect I had lost. Working as a consultant was bittersweet. On one hand, I felt valued again and could see my ideas making a difference. On the other, the wounds from the salary cut and suspension still lingered. It was difficult to walk the halls knowing some former colleagues viewed me as a troublemaker or traitor. The office politics hadn't disappeared, they had just shifted. But I was determined not to let resentment consume me. I focused on what I could control: my work and my integrity. I met regularly with Claire, the investor's representative, who continued to support my efforts. Together, we developed strategies to increase transparency and improve communication between management and staff. I organized workshops on ethical leadership and created anonymous channels for employees to voice concerns safely. These initiatives slowly helped rebuild morale and trust within Crestwood. Outside work, I started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped displaced professionals find new careers after layoffs or corporate conflicts. Sharing my story and hearing others' experiences deepened my understanding of how common workplace injustice really is, and how powerful resilience can be. I found purpose in helping others navigate uncertainty and rebuild their lives, just as I was doing. Financially, the consulting role and side projects helped me regain stability, but I still had to be cautious. I lived frugally, avoided unnecessary expenses, and focused on saving. Every dollar mattered, and the experience taught me the importance of financial independence. I started building an emergency fund and exploring passive income streams to create a buffer against future surprises. The entire ordeal transformed my view of leadership and success. I no longer equated career advancement solely with titles or paychecks. Instead, I measured success by the impact I made, the values I upheld, and the relationships I nurtured. I realized that true leadership requires courage to speak up, even when it's risky, and humility to learn from failure. The public attention from the Crestwood saga also brought unexpected opportunities. Invitations to speak at industry conferences and webinars poured in. People wanted to hear my story, not just for the drama, but for the lessons on resilience, ethics, and navigating corporate power struggles. I found myself mentoring younger professionals who were facing similar challenges, encouraging them to stand firm in their principles. Despite the progress, some days were harder than others. The emotional scars from the betrayal and financial strain didn't disappear overnight. Anxiety and self-doubt lingered, especially when reminded of the broken promises and lost opportunities. Therapy and mindfulness practices became crucial tools in managing these feelings and maintaining my mental health. Looking back on that tumultuous period, I'm proud of how far I've come. What started as a devastating setback turned into a journey of growth, empowerment, and meaningful change. I learned that standing up for what's right often comes at a cost, but the rewards, both personal and professional, can be greater than imagined. I didn't sleep well that night after speaking with Mr. Fallon. Not because I was nervous, but because a storm had started to brew inside me. I stared at my ceiling fan, its slow rotation barely audible over the thoughts racing through my mind. It was surreal. The man who had sliced my salary by more than half was now calling me for help. And not just any help, he was practically begging me to save the company. A week ago, I was humiliated. Now I held the cards. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted him to sweat a little. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be left in the dark, unsure of whether someone would come to your rescue. Not out of cruelty, but because it was time he understood the value of the people he so easily discarded. But I also needed time to think. I wasn't sure I even wanted to go back. I had already begun planning my next chapter, had started having conversations with companies that valued people over politics. Walking back into his mess felt like rewinding the worst part of my life. But there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the opportunity to finally set the record straight, to take control, and to make sure that no one else would be blindsided the way I had been. After 2 days of silence, I called him. "Mr. Fallon," I said calmly, "I'll help you, but on 3 conditions." He was silent for a moment, probably stunned that I wasn't groveling. "Okay, go ahead." "First, I don't want to be rehired. I'll work as an independent consultant. I choose my hours, and I'm paid up front." "All right," he said, his voice tight but compliant. "Second, I want full access to all departments, unfiltered. No middlemen. If you want me to fix this, I need to see the rot myself." He hesitated. "That's fine." "And third," I paused for dramatic effect, "you do not interfere. You let me work, you let me speak to whoever I need, and you do not undermine me. If you do, I walk, and I won't come back." He exhaled slowly. "Deal." I knew he didn't like it, but he had no choice. The next Monday, I stepped back into the building, not as an employee, but as a storm in heels. I wore confidence like armor, and this time, no one was going to take it off me. I was welcomed with strange looks. Some people avoided eye contact, while others nodded at me with curious glances. A few brave ones even smiled, maybe out of relief, maybe out of hope. Word had already spread. They knew something was shifting. Fallon tried to play it cool, but his nervous tics gave him away. His office was cluttered, and it smelled faintly of stress. Too much coffee, not enough success. He briefed me quickly, then left me to get to work. My first step was to gather data. Unfiltered, uncooked data. Sales reports, client contracts, project timelines, even interdepartmental emails. I wanted to see exactly where the collapse had begun. It didn't take long. The financial bleed was obvious. 2 major clients had pulled out due to service failures. Employee morale was at rock bottom, and some of the company's most talented people had already jumped ship. There was no innovation pipeline, no strategy for client retention, and worst of all, no leadership. I spent the first week gathering information and mapping out a triage plan. I reorganized the sales team, assigned new leadership to the accounts, department, and reopened communication lines with former clients. One of them, a multi-million-dollar account, agreed to return if we implemented certain changes, which I did within 48 hours. Employees started to whisper, "Who is she working for? Why is she doing his job?" But I didn't care. I wasn't there for gossip. I was there to clean house, and the results were already speaking for themselves. By the end of the second week, we had secured 3 contracts and stopped 2 more from terminating. The hemorrhaging had slowed. I started holding briefings, openly, talking to staff about the changes, the expectations, and the vision moving forward. Something Fallon had never done. I didn't sugarcoat things. I told them the truth. The company was 2 months from shutting down, but that it didn't have to end that way. People listened. Fallon, meanwhile, remained eerily silent. I think he realized that the more he stepped back, the better things became. That realization must have stung. I was solving a mess he created, and I wasn't even on payroll. But I wasn't just saving a company. I was proving a point. I was proving that leadership isn't about title or power. It's about action, trust, and integrity. That slashing someone's salary doesn't make you strong. It makes you small. That underestimating people comes at a cost. And I was keeping receipts, all of them. Every change I made, every dollar I recovered, every client I brought back, I documented it. Not to boast, but to protect myself. I knew Fallon. I knew how he operated. Once the company was back on its feet, he would either try to claim credit or push me out again. I had no intention of letting either happen, so I built a system. I installed protocols that only I could access. I linked them to outside reporting tools that tracked and time-stamped every major action. In the event he tried to erase my impact, I could show the entire story, data, signatures, and all. By week 4, the company was breathing again. Staff were engaging, sales were climbing, clients were calling back, asking if the new system was permanent. I smiled at that. There was no new system. It was just the right one, finally being used. At this point, Fallon called me in. "Want you to come back full-time," he said, "as VP of Operations, with equity." I looked at him, calm but firm. "No." His face twitched. "What do you mean, no?" "I already have what I want," I replied. "And I'm not putting myself back under someone who once thought cutting my salary by 70% was a good idea." "You're making a mistake." "No," I said, standing up. "You did, and you just haven't paid for it yet." And with that, I walked out. Again. But this time, I was walking toward something bigger. I didn't go back to that office the next day. I didn't have to. The contract I'd negotiated allowed me full control from a distance. And that's exactly how I liked it. Close enough to steer the wheel, far enough not to drown in their chaos. But I knew the next phase would be crucial. I'd stopped the bleeding, but the wound was still raw. I'd stabilized the patient, but the disease, Fallon, was still in the room. That week, I noticed something peculiar. Fallon had started copying my exact proposals and presenting them as his own to the board. The memos I sent him confidentially, they were suddenly part of his strategic vision. The meetings I organized with clients, he was attending them, without me, and taking credit for reactivating those relationships. I watched it unfold, silently. I wasn't surprised. He hadn't changed. He was just playing a different game now. Before, he wanted to discard me. Now he wanted to wear me like a mask. But here's the thing. I anticipated this. From the very beginning, I structured everything through a secure external platform I controlled. Every client email, every internal process I redesigned, every signature from me, all time-stamped, recorded, and backed up. So when the board began congratulating Fallon for the turnaround, I knew it was time to introduce a new character to the story. Her name was Amanda Reeves. Amanda was a former colleague of mine from a consulting agency I worked at years ago, brilliant, sharp, and respected in the business community. She now sat on 2 corporate boards and occasionally offered third-party audits for high-level restructurings. We'd stayed in touch. I reached out and asked her if she'd be willing to conduct a discreet operational review of Fallon's company. I framed it around transparency and accountability, something investors and stakeholders always love to hear. Amanda agreed, but only if she could speak with employees privately and review back-end systems without executive interference. Perfect. I pitched the idea to the board's CFO through my channels, under the premise of future-proofing the company. He took the bait. Within a week, Amanda was onboarded under the radar to perform what they called a resilience audit. And that's when the fun began. Amanda's audit peeled back the layers of the company like an onion, revealing not just my contributions but also Fallon's incompetence. From the moment she started reviewing the back-end systems I built, it became clear who was really driving the results. And when she spoke to team leaders and account managers, the truth poured out. He didn't even know the client's name. Until last week. She told us to change the onboarding system. That's what saved the deal. I'd still be job hunting if she hadn't talked to me directly. Amanda documented everything, every discrepancy, every misattribution, every piece of work that bore Fallon's name but not his effort. The audit report was submitted to the board 2 weeks later. Amanda requested a formal meeting to present her findings. I was invited. Fallon wasn't told why. That morning, I arrived 15 minutes early. I took a seat at the far end of the boardroom table and watched as the members trickled in, their eyes occasionally darting to me with recognition and curiosity. Fallon strolled in last, his suit crisp, his smirk smug. He nodded at me like I was some intern back from lunch break. Amanda stood up and began her presentation. Slide after slide, she laid out the facts, system improvements, revenue upticks, staff retention milestones, reactivated accounts, all traced back to a single user account, mine. Fallon fidgeted. Then he tried to interrupt. I guided all of that work. She just handled some of the admin. Amanda didn't flinch. We interviewed over 20 employees and verified documentation. Not one person attributed these changes to you. And the digital signature logs confirm it. Silence fell over the room. One of the board members, a quiet but firm man named Grant, leaned forward. So, you're telling us that she, acting as a consultant, effectively reversed a company-wide crisis and restored operations in under 2 months? Amanda nodded. That's correct. And we were about to make Fallon the face of that success? Another nod. I sat calmly, watching Fallon shrink in his chair. The CFO looked at him, then at me. You've had this evidence all along? I simply said, yes, but I wanted you to see it for yourselves. Fallon started to defend himself. He rambled something about legacy systems, long-term planning, executive oversight, but no one was listening. The illusion had shattered. The man who tried to erase me was now being exposed in front of the very people he needed most. It was poetic. The board called for a recess. When they returned, they asked Fallon to leave the room. He was stunned. Why? We need to have a confidential discussion, Grant said coldly. About leadership integrity. He left. The door shut behind him like a tomb. They turned to me. We owe you an apology, the CFO said, and a proposal. I raised an eyebrow. We'd like you to stay on, not as a consultant, but as interim COO. Full executive privileges. Your systems, your team, your strategy. You'll report directly to the board, not to Fallon. I smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. I'll consider it, I replied. Because now I had the power, and I was just getting started. I didn't give them an answer right away. That might surprise some people. But after everything I'd been through, what Fallon did, what I learned about trust, about people, I wasn't in a hurry to jump into another high-stakes leadership role, especially not in the same place that tried to bury me just months before. So, I asked for a week. Not for negotiations, not to drive up my value. No. I wanted to think, really think, about what I wanted. For the first time in years, I had leverage. And I had clarity. I wasn't hungry for a title anymore. I wasn't chasing validation. I was chasing purpose and peace. In that week, I took a trip. Not to some tropical island, not to a spa. I went home, not home as in the place I lived, but the town where I grew up, a dusty little suburb in Colorado where my parents still lived. My dad ran a small auto repair shop. My mom helped at the local library, salt of the earth people. They didn't know much about IPOs or mergers or consultancy audits, but they knew me. They knew who I really was before the world tried to mold me into something else. We sat on the back porch, and I told them the whole story. Every ugly detail, every betrayal, every victory. My mom cried when I told her how Fallon cut my salary after my promotion. My dad clenched his jaw when I explained how he tried to take credit for my work. But when I finished, when I told them how I turned it around and was now being offered the COO role, my dad didn't smile. He just said, "So what now? You climb the same ladder again? Or build your own?" Those words echoed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the people I'd met who were just like me, talented, overlooked, silenced, and replaced. People whose ideas got stolen, whose effort was never acknowledged, who kept showing up even when it hurt. I remembered their faces, their voices, their tired smiles. And then I realized, I didn't want to save one company. I wanted to build a space for all of them. A space where people like me could thrive without politics and manipulation, and glass ceilings disguised as glass doors. By the end of the week, I had my answer. I flew back into the city and scheduled a meeting with the board. Everyone was there. Amanda, Grant, the CFO, even the legal counsel. Fallon was notably absent. I thanked them sincerely for their trust, their reconsideration, their willingness to listen. Then I gave them my decision. I'm turning down the COO position. You could hear a pin drop. But I'm not walking away, I added quickly. I'm proposing a different kind of partnership. Their brows furrowed, curious. I'm launching my own firm, an executive consultancy focused on rebuilding ethical, people-first organizations. I'll train teams, design systems, and identify future leaders who are often overlooked, and I'd like your company to be my first client. Silence again. This time not out of shock, but consideration. Grant leaned forward. And what would that look like? A 1-year retainer. I'll oversee the transition, train your internal staff, and build a sustainable leadership model. You won't need to replace Fallon. You won't need another outsider to patch things up. I'll leave. You stronger than I found you. The CFO looked at the legal counsel, then back at me. You'd do that? After everything? I nodded. Because people deserve better. And so do you. The vote was unanimous. They accepted. And just like that, I was no longer someone's employee, someone's problem, or someone's threat. I was the architect of something bigger. The next few months were a whirlwind. I built the bones of my new firm, named it Anchor Ethics, inspired by the idea of holding steady in rough waters. I brought in Amanda as my advisory partner. I hired a few people who had been quietly fired by companies like Fallon's. brilliant minds who just needed a chance. I set up the back end, secured my first few clients, thanks to word of mouth from the board, and we were off to the races. Meanwhile, Fallon? He didn't fare as well. After Amanda's report was shared with investors, confidence in his leadership plummeted. His stock options were frozen pending an internal investigation. And when news of the audit leaked to a few industry insiders, doors started closing on him fast. He tried to apply for other executive roles, but no one wanted the guy who was outmaneuvered by his own consultant. Eventually, he tried to launch his own company. It folded in 4 months. Last I heard, he's doing small-time speaking gigs, charging a few $100 to talk about leadership under pressure. Ironic, really, but that wasn't my story anymore. Mine was unfolding in real time, bigger, brighter, and grounded in something Fallon never had: integrity. I started getting invitations to speak, not because I was flashy, but because I was real. People wanted to know how I survived the sabotage, how I kept my head up, how I turned betrayal into business. I told them the truth. You don't need revenge, you need vision. And if you can hold your ground long enough, the world has a way of circling back, of rewarding those who did the right thing, even when no one was watching. Fallon cut my salary by 70% during a promotion, thinking he could steal my work and erase my presence. But in doing so, he handed me the motivation to build an empire that now shapes the very industry he tried to dominate. And that's the sweetest twist of all. The first few months of Anchor Ethics were both exhilarating and overwhelming. Exhilarating, because for the first time in years, I was building something entirely my own, without manipulation, without fear. Overwhelming, because running your own firm, even with the backing of influential clients, is a completely different beast from being a cog in a larger corporate machine. I'd traded predictable stress for purposeful chaos. Amanda and I often worked 12-hour days, meeting with HR directors, compliance heads, and frustrated department leaders from companies looking to change, not because they had to, but because they finally wanted to. Our work wasn't flashy, but it was transformative. We dug deep into broken systems, rewrote policies, coached leaders, and empowered frontline employees. And unlike the performance audits that Fallon used to cover his tracks, ours didn't end with reports. They ended with results. Our client roster grew rapidly. Word spread through executive networks about a firm that didn't just consult, but delivered. Within 6 months, we had contracts with 3 major mid-sized tech companies, 1 Fortune 500, and several nonprofits. Not bad for a company born out of betrayal, but I wasn't just building a firm, I was building a mission. We created a scholarship program to sponsor young professionals from underrepresented communities who wanted to get into business ethics and organizational leadership. We mentored recent grads who'd been told they were too idealistic for corporate life. We gave them tools, not just theory. And one of the most fulfilling parts? Watching those same young people go into companies and quietly, methodically, change the culture from within. Fallon, on the other hand, couldn't escape his own shadow. Every few weeks, someone would send me a link, an awkward podcast appearance, a desperate LinkedIn post, or a video from a half-empty seminar he was leading titled Reclaiming Authority in the Workplace. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In trying to dominate, he destroyed his own credibility. In chasing control, he lost all influence. I didn't waste time gloating, though. The truth is, I barely thought about Fallon anymore. Not because I'd forgiven him, though I was working on that, but because he no longer had power over my future. That was something I'd reclaimed. The real surprise came in the form of an email 3 months after Anchor Ethics celebrated its 1-year anniversary. It was from Fallon. The subject line simply read, "Coffee?" My immediate reaction was laughter, then confusion, then curiosity. Why on earth would he want to meet? I showed the message to Amanda. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Maybe he wants to pitch something. Or beg. Either way, I'd go. If only." For the story, I hesitated for a few days. Not out of fear. Out of principle. I didn't owe him anything. Not my time, not my presence, not even a conversation. But a part of me wanted to see what he looked like now. Not physically, spiritually. What does a man look like after losing everything he once stood on? So I agreed. We met at a small upscale cafe not far from where his old office used to be. He was already seated when I walked in, a shadow of the man I once knew. His suit still looked expensive, but it hung on him differently now. Looser, less certain. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, seemed dulled by time and loss. He stood up, extended his hand, and said, "Thank you for coming." I nodded and sat. Down. No handshake. I wasn't here to relive old rituals. There was a moment of silence. Then, he sighed. "I deserved everything that happened," he said, without prompting. "The loss, the exposure, the exile. I was arrogant. I thought I was untouchable. I let him talk. I used people," he admitted. "I used you. I knew your audit would clean up the mess I made, and I figured, why not get ahead while I still could? But I underestimated you. Not just your skills, but your integrity." That last word sat heavy in the air. Finally, I spoke. "Why am I here, Fallon?" He looked me dead in the eye. "Because I want to help you." I blinked. "Help me. I've been out of the game, but I still have relationships. I know you're growing. I've heard the chatter. I can open doors for you. Clients, investors, partners." I nearly laughed. "You think I need you to open doors?" He shook his head. "No, I think maybe I need you. I want to build something again. Something real this time." And just like that, it clicked. He was hoping I'd pull him back into relevance, that I'd throw him a lifeline so he could redeem himself through my success. But here's the thing. Redemption isn't something you outsource. I leaned forward. "Fallon, I genuinely hope you've changed. I hope you find a way to rebuild. But I'm not your lifeline. I'm not your redemption story. And I'm certainly not going to let you ride the wave you once tried to drown me under." He nodded, slowly. He didn't argue. Maybe deep down he already knew the answer. We finished our coffees in silence. He thanked me again and walked out without another word. As I watched him disappear into the crowd, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just peace. Because the real victory wasn't bankrupting him or watching his empire crumble. It was sitting across from him as someone who had nothing to prove. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the builder. And Fallon? He was just another cautionary tale in a story that had only just begun. As I walked back to my car after that surreal coffee meeting with Fallon, a calm certainty settled in my chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even closure in the traditional sense. It was something more profound, an understanding that the person I had become no longer needed to be in conflict with the person I used to be. And that meant Fallon no longer held any space in my head. In the weeks that followed, our firm didn't just grow, it transformed. Anchor Ethics was now entering its next evolution. We'd recently signed 2 international clients, both facing major cultural shifts in the wake of whistleblower exposés. These weren't the kinds of companies looking to slap a Band-Aid on a PR crisis. These were businesses serious about reprogramming their internal DNA, and they wanted us to lead the charge. Amanda spearheaded the overhaul of our onboarding systems, and we expanded our team. I made it a rule to personally interview every single new hire. Not to micromanage, but to ensure our values remained intact. We didn't care about resumes with the right companies on them. We cared about people who had been bruised by the system, yet still believed it could be redeemed. One applicant, a soft-spoken guy named Caleb, stood out to me. He had a background in logistics, but his former company had let him go after he tried to expose a shipment scam that was costing the company millions. When he talked about it, there was no bitterness in his voice, only clarity. He said, "I don't want revenge. I just want to work somewhere that doesn't punish you for doing the right thing." He was hired on the spot. That became a quiet motto in our office: do the right thing, even when no one is watching, and especially when everyone is. We also started getting calls from journalists. Some wanted to profile us as a disruptive force in corporate consulting. Others were curious about our origin story. And though I declined most offers at first, Amanda eventually convinced me to do one in-depth feature with a reputable business magazine. The article dropped under the headline, "The Consultant Who Burned Her Bridge, Then Built a New City." It went viral. Suddenly, our inbox was flooded with inquiries, not just from potential clients, but from everyday professionals who'd felt voiceless in their own companies. People who had stories of gaslighting, of discrimination masked as performance metrics, of bosses who took credit and HR departments who looked away. They didn't want jobs. They wanted hope. Some just wanted to say thank you. That was the moment I realized our mission had outgrown us. We were no longer just helping companies fix broken systems. We were starting to awaken a movement of integrity-driven professionals who wanted to build better workplaces, whether inside existing corporations or by starting their own ventures. So we launched an initiative called the Ethics Incubator. It was a 12-week program for aspiring entrepreneurs, team leaders, and middle managers who wanted to lead with purpose. We gave them frameworks, mentorship, and real-time support as they tackled complex challenges in their own organizations. Some were able to reshape the culture of their departments. Others left and launched businesses that challenged the toxic norms of their industries. Each cohort ended with a summit, where participants shared what they'd done and what they still hoped to do. There wasn't a dry eye in the room at our first event. That night, as Amanda and I stood on stage to close the summit, I looked out at the room and saw something I hadn't dared to believe in when Fallon cut my salary that day. Legacy. Not the kind written in plaques or awards, but the kind etched in the way people treat each other every single day. The kind built in silence, in consistency, in courage. The kind that multiplies, not by scale, but by ripple effect. After the event, I got a message request on LinkedIn. It was from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Lauren. The woman who'd once been my biggest ally before she went quiet. Under Fallon's leadership, her message read, "I just read about you in Business Vision. I wanted you to know. I saw everything you did back then. I wish I'd spoken up. I should have. I didn't have the courage. But watching what you've built now, it gave me the nudge I needed. I've just submitted my resignation and accepted a role as Director of Ethics at a nonprofit. Thank you for being braver than I was. You gave me permission." I stared at the message for a long time. Not out of pride, out of disbelief. Because I hadn't realized until that moment that my story wasn't just mine. It was a lighthouse for people like Lauren, people waiting for a signal that it was safe to hope again. The next morning, I printed out her message and pinned it to the board in our office kitchen. No context, no names, just those 3 final words. You gave me permission. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But I've learned something else. Redemption, real redemption, is best served loud, clear, and with the full force of your growth on display. And if you do it right, it becomes more than redemption. It becomes a revolution. 6 months after launching the Ethics Incubator, I found myself standing backstage at a conference in Chicago. The organizers had asked me to give the closing keynote on transformational leadership in a broken corporate world. I was nervous, not because of the speech, but because I knew who was in the audience. A few rows back, seated in the corner of the conference hall, was someone I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Fallon. I didn't know whether she'd come out, of curiosity, guilt, or something else entirely. But she was here, and the symbolism wasn't lost on me. As I walked on stage, the lights washed over me, and the room of 200 people faded into a quiet hush. I wasn't here to call anyone out. I was here to speak to something larger than any one person. The deep yearning inside so many professionals to work with dignity, to lead with empathy, and to finally feel safe doing the right thing. My story, I began, starts the way many do, with a promotion I thought would change everything. Instead, it came with a 70% salary cut, a demotion in disguise, and a lesson I'll never forget. But that's not why I'm here today. I paused, watching heads tilt, people lean in. I'm here because what happened after that moment, the call I made, the path I chose, taught me something far more powerful. It taught me that when you stop waiting for someone else to give you permission, you start building something the world didn't think was possible. Throughout the talk, I shared the real moments, the shame of opening that new contract with the slashed salary, the cold meetings, the betrayal, the moment I decided to walk away. But I also talked about Amanda, the early days of Anchor Ethics, and the first time we turned down a client because they didn't share our values. The room wasn't just listening, they were absorbing. Not every person in the crowd had been betrayed like I had, but everyone had felt the squeeze of compromise. Everyone had struggled between doing what was right and what was expected. As I wrapped up my speech, I looked directly toward Fallon's seat. I used to think justice looked like exposing someone, proving I was right, making them regret ever crossing me. But I've learned that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's building something so good, so impactful, that the person who tried to bury you has to sit in the audience and take notes. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't even pride. It was peace. When the applause started, it didn't feel like noise. It felt like a release. From every buried injustice, from every moment someone had second-guessed themselves for standing up. And in that wave of clapping, I didn't see Fallon anymore. I saw all the Fallons that existed in boardrooms, agencies, and offices around the world, and I knew their power was fading. After the event, I stepped outside to get some air. The sky over Chicago was cloudy, but I felt clear. That's when a woman approached me. She looked to be in her early 50s, blazer over a plain gray blouse, a notebook tucked under her arm. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "I'm a director at a financial firm. I've been there 22 years, but I've stayed silent on things I shouldn't have. Your talk gave me clarity I didn't know I was looking for." She hesitated, then added, "I wrote my resignation letter last week. I brought it with me today. I think I'm finally going to send it." We talked for 15 minutes. She wasn't bitter. She was ready. Ready to build. Ready to lead. Moments like those reminded me that this story wasn't just about a salary cut. It wasn't just about Fallon. It was about the millions of professionals, men and women alike, who had quietly endured disrespect, been punished for honesty, or sidelined for integrity. Every time one of them made a move toward freedom, toward alignment, toward their calling, it meant the story was still unfolding. And then came the news. Fallon's consulting agency, once the darling of mid-tier Fortune 500 companies, had collapsed. A whistleblower report, released anonymously online, revealed that Fallon had knowingly signed off on a falsified compliance review for a major international tech firm. The resulting audit exposed a web of shady practices, and her agency was hit with 3 lawsuits in a single week. Clients fled, investors pulled out, and the company, once my professional prison, folded like a house of cards. I didn't gloat. I didn't post about it. I didn't bring it up at meetings or conferences, but I did sit with the moment. I let it land. The person who had taken my loyalty, slashed my worth, and tried to humiliate me into silence had destroyed herself. Not because I exposed her, but because her entire model was built on rot. It was never sustainable. And deep down, I think even she knew it. One afternoon, I received a letter. Not an email, a handwritten letter. No return address. Just my name in tight, neat cursive. It read, "I underestimated you. I thought your integrity made you weak. But it turns out that was your power. I won't ask for forgiveness, but I do want you to know you were right to walk away. I wish I had built something like you did." No signature. But I didn't need one. I folded the letter, tucked it in the back of my notebook, and got back to work. Because when you're walking in your calling, validation becomes irrelevant. What matters is momentum. What matters is legacy. And I had more work to do. 2 years after the collapse of Fallon's agency, the ethics incubator had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. What began as a single client advisory firm had transformed into a full-fledged movement. We had 27 employees across 3 continents, partnerships with universities, and a flagship ethics curriculum being piloted in Fortune 100 companies. But none of that would have mattered if it wasn't still personal to me. Deeply personal. One late evening, as I closed my laptop at the end of another 12-hour day, I looked around my office, walls lined with notes from grateful clients, framed quotes from thought leaders I admired, and a single small photograph of my first desk in that cold storage closet Fallon had stuck me in. It reminded me of where I came from. It reminded me of what resilience really looked like. There had been moments when I almost gave in, when I considered playing their game, staying quiet, and riding out the humiliation with a fake smile. But I didn't. I walked out with my spine straight and my spirit intact. And every step I'd taken since had been fueled by one truth. People may try to control your pay, your title, even your reputation, but they cannot take your values unless you hand them over. That belief had shaped every decision I made since. Leaving. One morning, I was invited to a roundtable with other founder CEOs hosted by a major national publication. The topic: Leadership After Collapse. As I walked into the glass-walled room high above downtown Los Angeles, I saw faces I recognized. Some from headlines, others from boardrooms I used to beg to be heard in. I took my seat, and soon, the moderator opened with a question that caught me off guard. Raise your hand if your biggest success came after your worst professional betrayal. Almost every hand went up, including mine. That room, full of powerful people, felt oddly vulnerable for a moment. We weren't there to boast. We were there to unpack the strange alchemy that turned sabotage into strength. After the event, I was approached by a man in his 60s wearing a navy suit and the kind of watch you only buy after your 3rd IPO. "I don't usually speak up in those things," he said, "but I wanted you to know something. What you said about rebuilding, from your center, not from your fear, that stuck with me. I've been successful, but I've also been gutless for a long time. You made me think about how I've led." I nodded, letting the silence speak for itself. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do in business isn't disruption, it's integrity. Later that same week, I attended a small reunion with a few former colleagues from Fallon's agency, people who, like me, had been burned but survived. Amanda was there too, her laugh still infectious, her energy as magnetic as ever. "I remember when you called me from your car," she said, raising her glass. "I remember thinking, he's crazy, or brilliant." Turns out it was both. We all laughed, but there was weight behind her words. Because those early days, cold coffee, blurry spreadsheets, rejection after rejection, had been the crucible. That's where our real work began. Now, Amanda was our chief strategy officer, and the agency she once watched fall apart was just a footnote in her story too. Over dinner, someone asked me what advice I'd give my younger self. I didn't hesitate. Your worth is not a line item. It's not negotiable. And it certainly isn't dictated by people who are threatened by your light. They'll try to dim you. That's what scared people do. But your job isn't to shrink. Your job is to shine and build things that last longer than their shade. The table went quiet. Amanda raised her eyebrows. Can we put that on the website? She joked. A week later, I was back at my office, signing copies of our first published book, Built from the Ashes: How to Lead After Betrayal. It wasn't just my story. It was a mosaic of stories from people like me, people who'd lost their footing but found their fire. And then, something surprising happened. I got a message request on LinkedIn, the name Fallon K. Eldridge. I stared at the screen for a long time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even curious. I was reflective. The message was short. I see what you've built. I can't undo what I did, but I hope someday you'll understand why I did it. Even if you don't forgive me, I want you to know you were right, and I was wrong. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to hold power over her, but because I no longer needed closure. I had built my own. Fallon had once slashed my salary, insulted my worth, and tried to bury my future. But she forgot one thing. When you try to destroy a builder, all you do is free them from your blueprints. I wasn't just building a business. I was building a legacy rooted in truth, resilience, and unapologetic integrity. My story didn't end with revenge. It ended with rebirth. And the best part? It's still being written. So to anyone out there who's been cut down, pushed aside, or told that your values are a liability, listen carefully. You're not too idealistic. You're not too sensitive. You're not too much. You're a builder, and your best work starts the moment you walk away from people who try to make you small. The call that bankrupted my boss didn't just change his fate, it changed mine too. Forever. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.